Hello, welcome to another episode on Law Minstrel, and today we are continuing our series on legal concepts that are relevant to nurses, and we'll be looking specifically today on consent as a concept. Let me pause here and enjoin you to become a member of our community if you're already not a member of this community. And you can do this by just simply clicking on the subscribe button. I also enjoy you to share our videos to your friends, persons within your sphere of influence, and also give us a like if you enjoyed our video and you want to pass a comment to me, there's something you want me to attend to, please let me hear from you in the comment section. It will be my pleasure. Thank you very much. So like I said, we are looking at consent today as a legal concept that is relevant to nursing. Consent has been defined by intensity law as a voluntary agreement to a specific course of action. A voluntary agreement to a specific course of action. That's a general definition of what consent is. But in a loose sense, consent means that there is a certain action that someone wants to take, maybe towards you, and then the person requires whether you agree, and where you have agreed, it will be said that you have consented to that action the person wants to be done to you. And whether you consent or not becomes very, very important. Why does it become important? In law, it is said that voluntary non-fit injuria. In other words, when you have consented to an action, then you cannot now complain about the injury. So you find that in medical parlance, of which nursing as a profession relates, constantly there are usually a set of given actions that have to be taken in the course of your health care delivery to a patient. And some of these actions that you have to take, they may occasion an injury that was not aforethought, that you had not envisaged that an injury is going to fall out of this procedure. So where a patient gives his consent to that procedure, then he cannot be held to complain about an injury that is occasioned by that set of action you have carried out on him by way of care. Is that all right? Good. So this is what is meant by a voluntary agreement to a specific course of action. When somebody voluntarily is not coerced into agreeing to a course of action you want to take towards him, then he will be said to have given what? His consent to that set of action. So it has also been said to refer to an individual's voluntary agreement to a specific course of action, often involving the relinquishment of certain rights. And this definition is given by Scoop Legal. And you will notice that in the course of explaining the intensity law's definition of what consent is, I've already delved into this. When I was saying that where an injury that was not aforethought falls from your action by way of care to a patient, the patient would be stopped from laying a charge against you where he has consented to that set of action. Then I will give you another definition of consent as given by Legal Information Institution on what consent is. And this is rather lengthy, but I think that it is very important, so you kindly pay attention to what they have said consent is. Consent means that a person voluntarily and willfully agrees in response to another person's proposition. The person who consents must possess sufficient mental capacity. Consent also requires the absence of coercion, fraud, or error. Consent is an essential constituent of a contract and a defense to a tort. However, consent is generally not a defense to criminal charges, with the possible exemptions of rape and sexual assault. I think that definition is very beautifully cast and brings out a lot of issues which I'll just quickly go over. They have said that consent means that a person voluntarily and willfully agrees to your proposition. In relation to a nurse now, you are proposing a set of, say, medical procedure or medical actions that are by way of care towards this person or patient. And so he is to voluntarily and willfully or willingly give that consent. So they went further to say that consent, when consent is said to be voluntary, it should be without coercion, it should be without fraud, it should be without error. These three issues, that patient's consent should be without them. You should not coerce the patient into giving consent. You should not obtain a consent from a patient by fraud, and you should also not make a patient give consent in error. In other words, this is going into the realm of giving informed consent. So consent is an essential constituent of a contract and a defense to a tort. So it's like that patient actually is in a contractual relationship with you, and consent is essential in contract. It's also essential as a defense in tort. So if what you have done would have ordinarily been like a tortious wrong to that patient, but the patient has consented to it, then that patient's consent can serve as a defense to you, where the patient initiates a tortious proceedings against you. So consent is generally not a defense in criminal charges. So if you have done something as a nurse in the course of discharging your duties, you now did something that amounts to a crime against that person, then that he consented to that procedure, which is a crime, would not serve as a defense. Essentially, that is what it's saying. So generally, consent does not serve as a defense in a criminal charge, but there are special criminal cases that consent can serve as a defense, like say where there's a criminal charge of rape. Now consent will serve as a defense because it will essentially convert that act from rape to consensual sex. Is that all right? Okay, thank you. So we'll move ahead now and look at the forms of consent. We are looking at three of these forms. They are essentially express consent, implied consent, and informed consent. We'll start by looking at express consent, and I'll be using the word express to define what express consent is. And I want to take the risk of using the word express to define what consent is, because I want to believe that you, of course, know what express is. When they say something is done expressly, you know what I mean. So when consent is given expressly, then that kind of consent is what? An express consent. So an express consent is the consent that is given directly, and it could be given either verbally or in written form, but is given directly. So is said to be given expressly when it's given directly. So it is an express consent. The other consent we are looking at is implied consent. So that implied consent is the opposite of express consent. So means that, and we said that express consent is a consent that is given how? Directly. So this consent that is implied means that it is not given directly, but you have now implied it or inferred it or read it as consent from certain things that happen. You now say, oh no, this person is consenting. So an implied consent is the consent that can be inferred from people's action or signs or facts, or even by inaction or silence. So there are sometimes that you will read a person's silence to mean consent. And I'm going to give you a very interesting example that I always use to give to let you know what implied consent means. I have a very dear colleague who is a senior colleague and whom I respect absolutely. He told me, and I think I'm free to share this because he said it not to only me, he said it to a group of which I belonged, that when he proposed to his wife never said yes. She never said no. But he went ahead and visited the lady's family to introduce himself as the person who wants to marry their daughter. And they did a ceremony that in Nigeria is called an introduction. Understandably, an introduction is a ceremony that is done for the families of both the intending groom and the intending bride to get to know each other. And I like to tell you that up to that point too, the lady didn't say yes or no. They went ahead to do a ceremony that is called a traditional marriage. And in this ceremony, the groom would pay the bride price, dowry, and all the gifts that they will ask him to bring in order to wed the bride customarily. He did that. The lady didn't consent by way of saying yes or no to his proposal. He went ahead and brought the lady to his house. Usually when you do the customary marriage, the bride's family will do a ceremony of taking the bride and all her belongings to your house if you are the groom. They did that. The lady never said yes or no. And now I like to tell you that they have born children. Some of the children have graduated from the university. The lady has still not said yes or no. Would you say the lady never consented to his proposal? Absolutely not. She did. Only she didn't do it directly. But we can infer that she consented to his proposal. I think that's an excellent example of what implied consent means. I will now finally look at what informed consent means. I keep saying that anytime you find two words forming a word, I think that's what's called in English language compound words. Compound words are words that are formed from two or more other independent words. That's a colloquial definition of what a compound word is, but I think that it works beautifully. So informed consent is formed from two words, informed and consent. Usually the second word, in this case consent, is the root word, and the first word, informed, acts as an adjective. And an adjective, as you of course know, is a descriptive word. It's a word that describes something. So in this way, informed is actually describing the kind of consent we are talking about. So the kind of consent we are talking about is an informed consent. An informed consent means that the person giving the consent gave it having been informed, gave it out of a position of being informed. So this means that he has been given a set of information and he's aware of the decision he's taking. That, and having been aware of the decision he's taking, he now consents that you should do the procedure you are talking about. In medical parlance, informed consent now means that you have informed the person of his condition. You have informed him of the possible options that are available to him. You have also informed him of the consequences of each of these actions or options that are available to him. He has now chosen this particular option he has chosen out of the information that is available to him. That's why we are now saying that he has taken what type of consent? Informed consent. So this is the consent given after the person has been provided with all relevant information about the risk, about the benefits, and alternatives that are involved in a particular procedure or course of action. This is the type of consent usually required in medical procedure. So any other consent that you obtained from a patient which is not informed does not meet the medical requirement of consent. Thank you. So we'll now look at validity of consent. When can we say that a consent that is given is valid? Means that there are some consents that you will obtain that in law they will not be valid. There may be a consent, but they will definitely not be valid. So for consent to pass the test of legal validity, the said consent must possess the test of the following, and I would like to enjoin you to listen carefully to these things that must be present before a consent will be valid. We are looking at 4 of them. The first is the age of the consenting person. The second is the sanity of the consenting person. The third is the locus of the consenting person. And finally, the manner in which that consent was given. And I'm now looking at the first issue, which is the age of the consenting person. The person whose duty it is to consent in the instant case must be of the age of consent. There is an age in law that is called the age of consent. And that age that makes a person of consenting age is 18. That's the legal age of consent. So if you have obtained that consent from someone that is not within that age, then that consent is not particularly valid. The second issue is the issue of sanity. Does that person have a sound mind? As at that time he was giving that consent, was he of sound mind? Was he sane? If he's not sane, then I'm telling you, he cannot give you a valid consent. Then the issue of locus. The person granting the consent must be the right person to grant that consent. So you want to do a procedure on a wife that is of legal age, has sound mind, is in a good frame of mind to give her consent. Then you go and look for a crooked way of getting the consent out of the husband, leave the wife there, then come back and do a procedure on the wife and say, after I got this consent from your husband. No, that's not the person that has the locus. It's the person's body. You are doing this on someone's body. You should get the consent out of the person who has the place to give that consent. If the person is not of sound mind, then there's another person who has a place to act as the person's guardian to give the consent. You cannot just, if it's someone that is not of sound mind, or maybe it's a child, you cannot just see someone passing on the road and you go and collect consent from the person. When they now come to ask you, who did you collect consent from? I saw somebody passing on the road and the person looks very responsible, so I got consent from him. No, that person must be a person that is in the position to give that consent, and that's who we refer to as the person who has the locus to give that consent. And finally, we'll be looking at the manner that that consent is given. So that consent should have been obtained without fraud, and it must have been given freely and without coercion, and also without duress. So we'll have come to the end of that, and then we'll now be looking at consent in legal context. Consent in legal context, and we are trying to look at the different legal situations and the type of consent that is required. So consent is first of all a general English word before it became a concept in law. So the law has not coined her own language. The law takes from the general pool of language and uses that language or word contextually within legal parlance. So this means that it does not possess any word that you take from a general pool of word, does not, when you now bring it into law, does not make it have an entirely new meaning. It will just have a specialized meaning in law. It will retain essentially its core characteristics. So before I got married, I was Mwesi Uji. So I now got married, I became Mwesi Mim. I did not change radically because I am now Mwesi Mim. No. I have retained essentially my personhood and my humanity. That's I'm hoping that this clicks with you in what I'm trying to say, that when you take a word from the general pool of language and bring it into law, it does not lose its essential character. It only gains a contextual meaning having been brought into legal parlance. So consent too has not essentially changed. It is still essentially consent, but consent as used here is entirely legal and should be understood within a legal context. To understand the import of consent better in the legal context, consent is casted in different legal contexts so that you will understand it clearly. So it is hoped that this would improve your appreciation of the concept when it is viewed in different legal contexts. The first context we'll be looking at consent is consent in criminal law. So the importance of consent is seen in that in criminal law, for instance, the presence or absence of consent can determine the lawfulness or unlawfulness of certain actions. So, and we gave an example earlier, so such as sexual activity or physical contact. So in sexual activity where there is no consent, then it will become a crime, to be rape. And in physical contact where there is no consent, then that contact, it may just be a simple touch, may become an assault or battery or both. So we'll look at consent in civil law. Consent in civil law is very, very relevant. Why is it relevant? It is relevant because it is a key factor in assessing liability and responsibility in cases having to do with, say, personal injury, with property damage, or even contractual disputes. So having said that, we will now examine consent in law of contract. In law of contract too, consent is very, very important. Consent is important in contract because it forms the core or is central in the formation of contract or contractual agreement. Whether that contractual agreement will be enforced or will not be enforced, consent is central to it. Because what is an agreement? An agreement is actually like the consents from two or more people form agreement. How can you agree without consenting? Agreement means you have given consent to something. So a contract is actually an agreement. So how can it be an agreement where there was no consent? So once the issue of consent becomes in doubt, then you cannot enforce your agreement or your contract at all. That's how relevant consent is to contractual agreement, and that is how central, how focal, and how core consent is in terms of contractual relation. So away from solely its legal significance, consent may also be seen as a moral and ethical principle as well. How is this so? In this regard, it ensures respectful and equitable interactions between individuals, persons, or even organizations, and even states at international or interstate level. So it is indeed consent that epitomizes the true sense, in the true sense, the fact that every person has the right to control what happens to their body, to their property, to their personal affairs, and even to their communities and to their nations. It's consent that epitomizes that. And finally, we'll look at consent now in medical parlance or in medical law. So consent is also found in the medical context, and you saw that when we're looking at informed consent. So within this context, it largely refers to consent to medical treatment. In medical law, when they are talking about consent, they are saying you are consenting to what? I think that that's the natural thing that comes to mind when you are hearing consent. The next thing you are asking is, what is this person consenting to? So in medical law, when you are talking of consent, what comes to mind is consent to medical treatment. So since a person has a right to control or right of control over his body, then consent is required before they can be given any kind of treatment at all. The consent required must be given freely, must be informed, must be specific, must be unambiguous, and must also be verifiable. So the consent emphasized in medical parlance is informed consent. Informed consent entails that the person has been explained to in the manner he will understand, and he in fact understood his health condition and treatment choices available to him. You will not say that he was informed in a manner he would understand, because sometimes you will think you informed someone in the manner the person will understand, yet the person did not understand. So the two must go together. You will inform him in the manner he understands, and you will check to see that he or she actually also understood it. So basically, there are three components of informed consent in medical parlance, and these are: the patient is informed in the manner in that he has received information about his medical condition and treatment options. 2, the patient understands his medical condition and treatment options. And 3, the patient is able to decide what treatment option he wants, as well as gives his consent in order to receive it. Those are the 3 components that must be present. So consent to treatment not only allows the patient the right to make the decisions as concerns his treatment, but also fosters trust between the patient and the healthcare provider that is providing him with the treatment that he requires. It equally protects the healthcare provider from litigation such as battery and assault and so on. By way of conclusion, consent generally protects from the incidences of exploitation, abuse, and unjust treatment. Consent also sets boundaries. It sets limitations on what others can do to an individual. The legal definition of consent, as we have seen from this study so far, is in sync and aligns with other legal and moral mores as respect for individual rights and dignity of the human person. With this, we come to the end of this study on what consent is. And to wrap it up, I will just do a quick run through of what we did on this episode. We first of all examined what consent is by looking at the definitions of what consent is. Then we looked at the forms of consent, and by this we looked at express consent, we looked at implied consent, and we also looked at informed consent. Then we looked at validity of consent, what we make consent to be valid, and we looked at the issue of age of the person. We looked at the sanity, we looked at the locus, and then we looked at the manner in which the consent was given. Then we looked at consent in legal context, and in this manner we looked at consent in criminal law, we looked at consent in civil law, we looked at consent in the law of contract, and then we ended up by looking at consent in medical law. And in medical law, we looked at 3 essential things that must be present when we say that a patient has given informed consent. And we said that the patient is informed in that he has received information about his medical condition and the treatment option that he has. Then we also said that the patient understands the medical options, his medical condition, and the treatment options that are available to him. And then we finally said that the patient is able to decide what treatment option he wants, as well as gives his consent that that treatment option be given to him. With this, we come to the end of this study on what consent as a concept is and how it is relevant to nurses. Thank you very much for your patience, for sitting through this episode. I do really appreciate that, and I also enjoin you to become a member of our community by clicking on our subscribe button if you're already not a member. And you can share this. Please go ahead and share this on your own platforms to your persons within your sphere of influence. Give us a like if you did enjoy the episode as much as we, or even half or a fraction of how we enjoyed bringing it to you. And you want to send me a comment, there is something you really want us to touch, like do an episode on, please do send it to us via the comment section. I'll meet you down in the comment section. If you liked it, give us a like, and till next episode, I remain yours sincerely, Nwusi Udugbe. Thank you.